Pike County, Ohio. A place where the ridges roll like tired shoulders, where the air smells faintly of coal dust and wet earth, and where people keep to themselves. It is not a county strangers visit often. The highways cut around it, and those who drive through don't slow down. To most, it is just another forgotten corner of Appalachia. But if you take the back roads winding into the hills, you'll find another kind of life. Small towns with boarded-up shops, rusting trailers with tarps over the roofs, and tucked deeper still in the brush-choked hollows along forgotten railroad beds, you'll find the camps. The homeless live here, not the kind you see on city sidewalks with cardboard signs. These are men and women burned out of factories, veterans no one wanted back, addicts who wandered too far from treatment centers, kids who left home and never returned. They huddle in tents and shacks pieced from plywood and corrugated tin. They cook on trash fires, drink creek water laced with iron and runoff, and sleep with knives at their side. The people in these camps are invisible to most, except, as you'll hear tonight, to something else. Because in Pike County, something was born in the shadows of an atomic plant. Something small, something overlooked, something that multiplied. And then it fed. The story begins not with a scream, but with a whisper. Locals will tell you there's always been something strange near the Portsmouth gaseous diffusion plant, just across the county line. That place, they say, poisoned the land for decades. Its fences rattled with secrecy. Its cooling towers bled into the groundwater. The government called it classified work. The people called it dangerous. For years, rumors spread of leaks, of barrels buried under the soil, of workers who got sick and died young. Cancer rates soared. Children were born with defects, and animals. Well, sometimes a deer would stagger out of the woods with tumors bulging like knots of clay beneath its hide. Hunters stopped bringing their kills home. But what nobody noticed were the ticks. Small, black-legged ticks, common in the hills. They were everywhere already, clinging to deer, to dogs, to the pant legs of hunters and hikers. But near the plant, their numbers swelled. Nobody studied why. Nobody thought twice when a few more showed up on a hound's belly or crawling across a tent wall. They were just ticks, pests, nothing more. Until they weren't. The homeless camp lay in a clearing off Toad Hollow Road, a muddy cut of dirt that wound into the hills north of the plant. A dozen tents and lean-tos sat clustered in a rough circle, with pallets laid down to keep the ground dry. Smoke curled from a 50-gallon drum where somebody burned scrap wood. At night, the camp was a quiet place. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Someone coughed in their sleep, and sometimes there was the faint patter of tiny legs across canvas walls. The first to notice was a man named Franklin, a veteran with one arm. He had a pup tent pitched near the tree line. One morning, he woke to find a cluster of ticks clinging to his sleeping bag. Not one or two, but dozens. A living blotch that twitched and writhed when the light hit them. He cursed, brushed them off, and burned the bag in the fire. Everyone laughed at his fussing. Ticks were normal. Ticks were part of life in the woods. But 2 nights later, Franklin screamed. They found him thrashing in his tent, slapping at his body. His shirt clung wet to his skin. When they pulled him into the firelight, they saw why. His torso was black with ticks. Hundreds of them. His chest looked alive. They had burrowed into him, their tiny legs thrashing as they dug beneath his flesh. The others tried to help. They pulled, they scraped, they tore at his skin with dirty knives. But the ticks clung deeper, as if welded to his meat. Franklin's screams broke into choking sobs, then silence. By dawn, he was dead. His skin sagged like a husk, pale and bloodless. And the ticks? They were gone. No one saw where they went. The camp whispered about it for days. Some said Franklin had wandered too close to the plant. Others swore he'd been cursed, or that it was some new drug eating him alive from the inside. But then it happened again. A woman named Jolene staggered into the clearing one night, gasping, her face blistered red. Her clothes hung in ribbons, chewed through by something no one could see. She clawed at her neck, screaming about bugs in her throat. When the others held her down, they saw the truth. Her tongue bulged as though something crawled beneath it. And when she opened her mouth, they swore they saw a tide of tiny legs writhing at the back of her throat. They didn't try to save her. They couldn't. She convulsed in the dirt until her body went still, her mouth hanging open. The others stepped back, shaking. None dared touch her. By morning, her corpse was gone. Only her clothes remained, shredded and wet with blood. The ground beneath them was alive with ticks, pouring into the earth like black water. Something was happening in Pike County. Something born of secrecy, of radiation, of a hunger older than the hills themselves. And though the people in the homeless camp didn't know it yet, Franklin and Jolene were only the beginning. The ticks had tasted blood. They had tasted fear. And now they wanted more. The hills of Pike County are quiet until they aren't. It is a silence that holds its breath, waiting for the next scream. After Franklin and Jolene died, the camp changed. Men who had lived shoulder to shoulder for years began to keep distance between their tents. Women who once shared food no longer trusted each other's hands. Every cough was a warning. Every itch beneath the skin made hearts stop cold. At night, no one slept. They sat up by the fire with knives in their laps, heads jerking at every rustle in the grass. They burned their clothes. They boiled creek water. They prayed. But no one left because there was nowhere to go. The nearest town was Waverly, a strip of gas stations and dollar stores, but the police there ran the homeless out with batons and tasers, and the shelters, they were full before winter even began. The woods were the only refuge. So the camp stayed, trapped between desperation and terror, and the ticks waited with them. The third attack came on a fog-thick morning. A man named Tanner, a kid really no older than 19, had gone to fetch wood. He was quiet, polite, always kept to himself. By mid-morning, when he hadn't returned, 2 others went looking. They found him in a clearing half a mile away. At first, they thought he was sleeping. He sat propped against a tree, chin on his chest. But when they drew closer, the truth came clear. His face was gone. Every inch of flesh had been stripped away. leaving only gleaming bone and wet sockets where his eyes should have been. His jaw hung open as though in a silent scream, but even his tongue had been torn out. His body was swollen with bites, skin shredded in thousands of tiny circular wounds. Around him, the ground moved. Ticks, hundreds, thousands, writhed like a living carpet, feasting on the scraps of meat that sloughed from his bones. The two men who found him didn't stay. They ran. They crashed through the underbrush, shouting warnings, until they burst back into camp gasping for air. And when they turned around, they saw the fog behind them shifting. It wasn't fog at all. It was a cloud. A seething black cloud of ticks, pouring over the earth like smoke. Panic tore through the camp. People scrambled from their tents, clutching what little they had. Knives, bats, axes, a single pistol with 3 bullets. They swung wildly as the first ticks hit. The creatures were faster now, hungrier. They came not in handfuls, but in waves. They leapt from the grass, clung to sleeves, burrowed beneath collars. Their legs pierced skin like needles. Their bodies swelled red as they fed. A woman named Corinne shrieked as her legs disappeared beneath a crawling tide. She tried to run, but her knees buckled, chewed to the bone in seconds. The others watched helplessly as she toppled face first into the mud, her body jerking the ground beneath her seething black. An old man, Gerald, swung a hatchet until his arms gave out. He cleaved handfuls of ticks in 2, but for every dozen he killed, 100 more swarmed up his legs. His screams curdled into gurgles as they filled his mouth, crawling down his throat, choking him from the inside. When his body collapsed, his belly writhed, swelling grotesquely before bursting in a spray of blood and black chitin. The campfire itself became a weapon. Desperate, the survivors shoveled burning logs into the dirt, smashing ticks beneath glowing coals. The air filled with the stench of scorched flesh, human and insect alike. But it wasn't enough. Not against what came next. One of the tents buckled, not from above, but from below. The ground beneath it split like a wound, and from it poured a torrent of ticks. Not dozens, not hundreds, but tens of thousands, flooding upward in a glistening tide. They weren't just hunting, they were nesting. The earth itself boiled black as the swarm erupted through the soil. A man named Reggie was too slow. He tripped as the ground gave way beneath him. His scream rose once, then vanished beneath the churning mass. His body was dragged down into the pit, shredded alive. For a moment the others saw his hand claw upward, stripped of flesh, nothing but glistening bone. Then even that was gone. The survivors did the only thing they could. They ran. Down the hillside they fled, scattering into the trees. Branches whipped their faces. Brambles tore their clothes. Behind them the swarm surged like a living tide, a whispering, skittering flood. A woman named Leah stumbled and fell. Another camper, Michael, turned back to help her, only to see her body convulse in the dirt. She screamed his name, but her voice was cut short as ticks swarmed into her open mouth, silencing her in a gag of black legs. Michael ran, sobbing, leaving her thrashing body behind. By nightfall, only 6 remained. 6 out of more than 20. They huddled in an abandoned hunting shack, shoving furniture against the doors, stuffing rags into the cracks in the walls. The place stank of mildew and rot, but it was shelter, and shelter was survival. Inside, they sat in silence, listening. Outside, the woods hissed, a soft, steady whisper like rain against leaves. But it wasn't rain. It was legs, thousands upon thousands of tiny legs, waiting. The survivors didn't yet know the truth. They thought they had stumbled into a plague of nature, a freak mutation, something the plant had leaked into the soil. They thought if they could just wait it out, escape to town, someone might help them. But the truth was far worse. These ticks were not an accident. They were not born of radiation or chance. They were designed, and Pike County's forgotten men and women were the first test subjects in a weapon that was never meant to be seen by the public. The hunting shack was never meant to hold 6 people. It leaned against the hillside, sagging with age. The walls were thin, warped with damp, patched in places with rusted sheet metal. The windows were narrow, their glass long since shattered. But for the survivors, it was sanctuary. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and fear. Every board creaked under shifting weight. Every shadow seemed to move. They had dragged old furniture, a table, a bureau, a broken refrigerator door, to barricade the windows. Gaps still gaped between the boards, and every so often something outside tapped against them. Not like a fist, not like an animal, but like rain. The constant, steady patter of thousands of legs brushing against wood. There were 6 of them left. Michael, the quiet one with shaking hands. Leah's brother, Dean, who stared hollow-eyed at the floor, grief eating him alive. Ruthie, sharp-tongued, her face streaked with mud and dried blood. Curtis, a heavy man with an axe he refused to put down. And 2 others, Tanya and Marco, strangers to most of the camp, who clung together like frightened children. No one spoke at first. The only sound was the scratching. That faint, rhythmic rasp of insects sliding over the wood. It didn't come from one place. It came from everywhere, the roof, the walls, the floorboards. It was as if the shack were afloat on a sea of ticks, the tide rising. Then came the first breach. A gap near the ceiling, no wider than a finger. From it, something wriggled. A swollen body, slick with blood, forcing its way inside. Its legs clutched at the air. Curtis was on it before anyone else moved. He swung the axe in a savage arc. Wood splintered. The tick split in 2, spilling dark ichor across the floorboards. But the gap remained. And from that gap, 3 more bodies pushed inward. Panic broke loose. Ruthie screamed, stomping at the floor where another crack opened, black legs forcing their way through. Michael grabbed a board from the barricade and smashed it against the wall until the wood itself cracked. But for every tick they killed, more came. From the rafters, from the corners, from the dirt beneath the floor. The shack was becoming a coffin. It didn't take long for the first of them to die. Marco. He had pressed himself against a wall, trying to block a gap with his jacket, but the fabric bulged, then tore. The ticks came through, pouring into his shirt, his sleeves, his collar. He shrieked, clawing at himself, slamming his body against the boards. Tanya tried to help him, ripping at his clothes, but his skin was already moving, alive with the swarm beneath it. His face bloated, purple and red, as his throat swelled from within. Then, in a single terrible moment, his chest split. Ticks erupted from the cavity in a wet fountain, carrying his heart between them, still beating. Tanya's scream didn't stop, not when the swarm dragged Marco's body down, not when his blood splashed across her, not even when Curtis grabbed her arm and yanked her back. She kept screaming. The survivors pushed furniture harder against the cracks. They shoved rags into gaps. They tore boards from the floor and nailed them over windows. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The shack wasn't going to hold. Not against something designed to get in. It was Ruthie who spoke first. "They're not just bugs," she said, her voice low, almost lost under the sound of scratching. "They're trained. They're after us?" Curtis barked a laugh, bitter and broken. "Bugs don't get trained." But Ruthie shook her head. "No, you saw it. They didn't go for the deer. They didn't go for the coyotes. They went for us. Just us. It's like they know." Her words hung in the silence. And though no one answered, no one disagreed. By midnight, Tanya stopped screaming. She sat in a corner, eyes glassy, rocking back and forth. Her hands clutched Marco's blood-stained jacket. Dean muttered to himself, over and over, whispering his sister's name. Michael didn't speak at all. His eyes were fixed on the gaps in the wall, as though sheer willpower might keep them sealed. And above them all, Curtis stood guard with the axe, his knuckles white. The scratching never stopped. It grew louder, hungrier. At some point in the dark, Michael heard it, a sound different from the rest. Not scratching, not tapping. Whispering. At first he thought it was Dean, still muttering to his dead sister. But no, this voice came from outside. It was faint, muffled by wood, but it was there. A voice, human. Calling his name. Michael. He froze. The others saw his face and knew something was wrong. Ruthie asked him what it was, but he didn't answer. He crept toward the wall, heart hammering. The whisper came again. "Michael, open the door. We're here to help." But Michael knew that voice. It was Leah's. His friend, the one who had died hours earlier, her mouth stuffed full of ticks, her body convulsing in the mud. He had watched her die. And now she was outside, asking him to open the door. He'd backed away from the wall, shaking. "It's them," he whispered. "They're copying us." The others stared at him, horror dawning. And then they all heard it. Voices, dozens of them. calling names, pleading, weeping. The voices of the dead. Let us in. Please, it's cold. Don't leave us out here. The shack shuddered as something massive pressed against it, rattling the walls. Not a bear, not a man, but the swarm speaking with stolen voices. Curtis raised the axe. Ruthie clutched a broken board like a spear. Tanya began to laugh, soft and high, a laugh that cracked and broke and became sobs. Dean pressed his back to the door, tears streaking his dirty face. "It's her," he whispered. "It's Leah. She's alive." He reached for the latch. Michael shouted, but too late. The door swung open, and the swarm came in. The shack dissolved into chaos. The walls bled black as the swarm poured inside, crawling over walls, ceiling, floor. They dropped from rafters, sprang from shadows, sank into flesh with a hunger that had no end. Curtis swung until the axe stuck fast in the wall, then disappeared beneath a tide of legs. His body jerked and thrashed, then split apart as the creatures tunneled inside him. Tanya didn't fight. She opened her arms as if to embrace them. Her laughter turned to wet gurgles as they poured into her throat, bursting her chest open like a split wineskin. Ruthie fought like a cornered wolf, stabbing and stomping, shrieking obscenities until the swarm silenced her, tearing strips from her face until bone gleamed white. Michael fled, through a window, through the broken barricade, into the night. Behind him, the shack collapsed inward, its walls shivering as if alive, the screams inside drowned beneath the chorus of legs. When dawn came, the shack stood silent. What remained inside was no longer human. And the swarm was moving. Because by now the government had seen enough. The experiment was working. The ticks had learned how to hunt. And soon they would be sent somewhere new. Michael ran. His chest burned, lungs scraping with every breath. His shoes tore in the mud. The sky above was paling with dawn, thin streaks of gray stretching across the Appalachia hills. Behind him, the shack was gone. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it anyway. Ruthie's face torn away, Tanya's chest splitting, Curtis thrashing under a living tide. The swarm had taken them all. Now it wanted him. He stumbled through the underbrush, branches slapping his face, briars ripping his arms. The forest floor squirmed with movement. Every patch of moss, every shadow of leaves seemed alive. He kept running until his legs gave out, and then he crawled. Hours passed, though he couldn't track them. The hills twisted, ridges and valleys folding in on themselves like a maze. He thought he heard voices sometimes, Dean's, Leah's, but he knew better now. The ticks could mimic. They could become. And in the silence between voices he could hear the faint, steady sound of their pursuit. Not loud, not rushing, but constant. Like something patient. Something hurting him. Last, he collapsed by a creek. His body trembled with exhaustion, mud caking his face. He cupped water into his mouth, but it tasted bitter, metallic. And that's when he saw it. The sign. Not a tree, not a rock, but a marker. A yellow metal stake driven into the ground, painted with the faded letters, Doe Property Restricted Zone. And behind it, through the trees, chain link fencing, high, topped with rusted barbed wire. Michael knew what it was. The plant. The one everyone in Pike County whispered about. The old Department of Energy site. Once a uranium enrichment facility, long shut down, though people said it still hummed at night. An accident, they always said. That's what caused the blowing fish in the creeks, the sickness in the soil. That's where the ticks had been irradiated. But staring at that fence, Michael felt the truth rise in his throat like bile. This wasn't an accident. Not anymore. The fence was bent in one place, the wire peeled back. Something had gone through from the inside. Michael hesitated, but behind him the forest shifted. A ripple, a tide. He squeezed through the gap. On the other side, the woods gave way to clearing. Broken pavement, cracked and overgrown, led to looming structures. Cooling towers half collapsed. Warehouses gutted, their windows gaping black. And in the middle of it all, lights. Harsh white floodlights mounted on poles, buzzing against the dawn. The plant was not dead. It was alive. Michael staggered forward, his head swaying, dizzy with exhaustion, but curiosity cut deeper than fear. He followed the cracked pavement, past signs half swallowed by rust. Authorized personnel only, biohazard zone. Keep out. The air here smelled sharper, metallic, sweet and rotten all at once. And then he saw them. Cages. Row after row of wire enclosures, hidden behind warehouse walls ripped open long ago. Inside them, bodies. Not alive, not exactly. At first, he thought they were mannequins, too still, too twisted, but as he drew closer, the truth curdled his blood. They were people, or what was left of them. Bodies slumped against bars, flesh cratered with bite marks, skin swollen and purple. Their tongues were gone. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, frozen in masks of agony. Each cage held only one, and on every door a label. Numbers, names. Like they were cataloged. Like they were test subjects. Michael's stomach heaved. He staggered back, pressing a fist to his mouth. The ticks hadn't escaped the plant. They hadn't been irradiated by mistake. They had been bred here, cultivated, trained. He stumbled further, past more cages, into the open yard. His eyes caught movement. Figures, not ticks. Men, dressed in black, faces masked, carrying rifles slung across their backs. They moved with precision, boots striking pavement in unison. Michael froze, his breath caught in his throat. The men didn't move like guards. They moved like hunters. And then one of them spoke into a radio. Subject located. Michael turned to run. His legs screamed, lungs tearing, but he pushed forward, past cages, past warehouses toward the far end of the yard. The fence loomed again, this one higher, topped with coils of razor wire. Behind him, boots pounded. Voices shouted, "Don't let him out." A shot cracked, a warning. The bullet ricocheted off concrete by his feet. Michael threw himself against the fence. He clawed at it, fingers bleeding, trying to climb. A voice barked, "Drop him." And then pain bloomed white-hot in his side. Something struck him, not a bullet, but a dart. His body stiffened, muscles locked. The world tilted. He fell. When he woke, it was dark. Not the dark of night, the dark of a room. He lay strapped to a metal table, wrists bound in steel cuffs, leather cutting into his ankles. Above him, a light burned too bright. The air stank of antiseptic, and beneath it, something worse. Blood. Rot. A door hissed open. Footsteps approached, and then a voice, calm, male, crisp with authority. "You shouldn't have seen this." Michael turned his head, blinking against the light. A man in a lab coat stood over him, face shadowed. His hair was neatly parted, his expression unreadable. "You think this was an accident," the man said. "You think some poor little bugs got into the wrong place at the wrong time. That's the story we let you tell yourselves, easy, comforting." He leaned closer. His eyes were cold, gray. "But the truth? The truth is far more useful." The man gestured. Another door slid open. From it, glass containers were wheeled in on a cart. Inside them, Michael saw movement. Ticks. Hundreds. But not like the ones in the woods. These were larger. Their bodies gleamed like wet obsidian, their legs spined with sharp bristles. Their eyes, if they were eyes, shone faintly red in the light. The man tapped the glass. The ticks twitched in unison, as though waiting for command. "Do you know what the greatest problem in this country is, Michael?" the man asked. Michael's throat was too dry to answer. The man smiled anyway. "Waste, unproductive bodies. People who drain resources but give nothing back. Your little camp in the hills, perfect example. No jobs, no property, no future, a burden." He tapped the glass again. "And so we built a solution." Michael shook his head, whispering, "You're monsters." The man tilted his head, curious, like a scientist watching a rat in a maze. "Monsters? No, we're innovators. Efficient. These creatures were designed to seek you out, to cull you, cleanly. No fuss, no oversight. Who will miss you? Who will question? Another nameless camp, another forgotten tragedy." He leaned down close. "And soon, not just here, not just Ohio, anywhere we decide waste needs cleaning." Michael struggled against the straps, but the cuffs cut deeper. The man stepped back, gesturing to someone unseen. "Prepare him," he said. The table began to move, wheels grinding. Michael was rolled forward through the door into a chamber that reeked of rot and old blood. The walls were lined with cages. Inside each, swarms of ticks, pressed so tightly together, their bodies writhed as one mass. The sound was deafening, a living tide, hungry and waiting. The man's voice echoed over the hum. "Let's see how long you last." The chamber door sealed shut with a hiss. Michael lay bound to the rolling gurney, wheels locked in place, leather biting into his wrists and ankles. The air inside the room was thick, humid, vibrating with sound. not the mechanical hum of the plant, the sound of life, of swarming, of hunger. The cages on either side of the chamber seethed with motion. Black-legged bodies pressed against mesh, legs probing the air. Their mandibles clicked in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost like speech. Michael twisted in his restraints, tendons straining. His skin burned with the memory of bites, but worse now was anticipation. The waiting. A speaker crackled overhead. The man's voice returned, calm, clinical. Test Group 9 is ready. Metal groaned as a hatch at the far wall opened. A gate on one of the cages slid upward with agonizing slowness. The swarm did not rush forward. Not yet. It poured out deliberately, a carpet of chitin, the ticks moving as one body, one consciousness. Their legs clicked in unison on the floor. They circled the gurney. They were studying him. Michael thrashed. The cuffs cut his skin, blood beading at his wrists. He tried to scream, but his voice cracked. The swarm tightened. A few broke from the mass, crawling up the legs of the gurney, across the wheels toward him. The first touched his foot. Its body was heavy, larger than any tick he'd seen outside. Mandibles dug through the fabric of his shoe, tearing leather, then flesh. Michael howled. Another climbed his calf, burrowing into the muscle. He felt it digging, grinding its way under the skin, its legs scratching as it vanished inside. The sound it made was not natural. A wet tearing, a crunch of cartilage. Blood ran down his leg in a steady stream. The man's voice floated through the intercom. Observe their precision. They take what they need. No waste. They remove tissue strategically, weaken muscle groups, disable their subject before full harvest. Michael arched his back, veins standing out on his neck. His eyes rolled white as another cluster of ticks scaled his torso. They bit in unison, hundreds of needles puncturing skin at once. He gasped, chest heaving, every nerve lit in fire. One reached his shoulder, its body bloated with black sheen. It crawled toward his neck, mandibles opening wide. Michael jerked, slammed his head to the side, and with a surge of raw desperation, he bit it. His teeth cracked through the carapace. Black ichor exploded into his mouth, bitter and metallic. The tick writhed, legs clawing at his lips, before he spat it out. It twitched on the floor, half crushed. The swarm reacted. They surged upward, an angry tide. The gurney rattled under their weight. Ticks piled on his arms, his chest, even his face. Mandibles tore through skin. 100 mouths drank. Michael screamed, a raw, tearing sound that echoed through the chamber. The intercom voice only noted, calmly. Pain threshold reached. Still conscious. Proceed. A second hatch opened. Another cage released. These ticks were even larger. Some as big as a human fist, their bodies pulsing, translucent with red fluid. They did not crawl. They leapt. One landed square on Michael's chest, mandibles plunging into his sternum, bone cracked. Blood gushed. Another leapt onto his face, biting into his cheek, digging until its head nearly disappeared into the wound. Michael bucked, howled, his body convulsing against restraints. The swarm fed with surgical violence. And then, a change. A blast of white gas hissed from vents in the walls. The ticks froze, mandibles still lodged in his flesh. Their bodies shivered, then retreated, skittering back toward the corners. The room fell still, save for Michael's ragged gasps. His body was shredded, skin hanging in ribbons, eyes swimming in red haze. Through the speaker, the man spoke again. Specimens respond well to pheromone override. Aggression ceases on command. Excellent control. Michael's blood dripped in steady rhythm to the floor. He was not food. He was data. The chamber door opened. 2 figures entered, faces masked, gloves slick. They wheeled Michael out, his gurney dripping with blood, down long halls lined with windows. Behind the glass, Michael saw more horrors. Rooms stacked with rows of cages. Homeless men and women strapped down just like him, their bodies being fed on encycles. Other rooms where the ticks were dissected, spines split open, organs removed and catalogued. Children's voices echoed faintly from deeper wings. Small bodies strapped down, unmoving, with jars of tongues placed neatly on counters. It was not chaos. It was order. Every detail tracked. Every subject numbered. Michael whispered, voice breaking, "Why?" But no one answered. He was wheeled into a new room. This one was quieter, cleaner. At its center stood a man he had not seen before. Not the scientist's cold face, not a soldier's mask. This one wore a suit, crisp, perfect, his hair neat, his tie straight. He smiled as Michael was rolled in. "Mr. Campbell," he said, voice smooth, practiced, "you've seen a great deal tonight." Michael's throat rattled. You made them." The man nodded. "Of course. And you're wondering why." He stepped closer, polished shoes clicking on tile. "The government has many programs. Some you hear about, some you don't. The homeless problem has always been inconvenient. We've tested camps, shelters, outreach, none efficient, none permanent." He gestured, and from the shadows, glass walls illuminated. Behind them, fields of ticks swarming in perfect circles, like trained animals waiting for release. "But this," the man said, "this is permanent." He leaned close, voice dropping. "No one mourns the forgotten." Michael's vision blurred. Blood loss dragged him toward unconsciousness. His thoughts slipped like sand. The man's voice followed him into darkness. "You won't survive this, Mr. Campbell, but that's the point. Your suffering is proof of concept. And once the proof is undeniable," he smiled again, teeth sharp in the sterile light, "we'll scale." The room faded. Michael slipped under, and the last thing he heard before blackness was the sound of cages unlocking. The swarm had been unleashed again. This time not for data, this time for disposal. Michael awoke to the sound of dripping. It was not the slow, casual drip of a pipe. It was rhythmic, heavy, a liquid metronome counting down his breath. When his eyes opened, he saw why. He was no longer strapped to the gurney. The restraints were gone, but his body, torn, bloodied, lay crumpled on a floor slick with fluid. The walls were concrete, stained dark. Chains dangled from hooks overhead. Some still held arms, half-severed, dangling like butcher's refuse. This was not a laboratory. It was a pit, the disposal chamber. Bodies were stacked in corners. Men, women, children, faces slack, eyes open but sightless. Their skin was riddled with holes, veins collapsed from blood loss. Ticks crawled across them in waves, swollen from feeding. Some so engorged they burst, splitting open, releasing smaller, twitching young. The stench was suffocating. rot, and iron. Michael pushed himself to his elbows, coughing. His vision swam. His hands slipped in the blood pooling beneath him. From the far side of the chamber, something shifted. A mountain of corpses collapsed inward, and from it rose movement, a mass. The ticks had fused, clustered, legs interlocking, bodies forming a pulsing black mound. It rose, higher than a man. Its surface rippled with crawling life, mandibles jutting outward like jagged teeth. At its center, something glowed faintly, a slick, wet organ beating like a heart. Michael stared, bile rising in his throat. This was no accident. This was evolution. The swarm was becoming singular, a hive. Michael staggered to his feet. His body screamed with every movement. His shoulder hung open, flesh gnawed raw. His chest was banded with bite marks. But the hive did not rush him. It studied. Dozens of black eyes shimmered in the dark, turning toward him as one. The clicking of mandibles slowed, synchronized, until it was almost language. Michael whispered, voice cracked. "What are you?" The mound pulsed. The heart at its core throbbed louder, faster. The swarm rippled outward, and suddenly ticks broke free, swarming across the floor toward him. Michael ran. His bare feet slipped in gore, but adrenaline drove him forward. He slammed against the chamber door, clawing at seams, but it was sealed tight. The swarm caught him. Ticks raced up his legs, digging, tearing. He screamed, tore them free, crushed them underfoot. But for every one he killed, 10 more replaced it. His back hit the wall. He swung wildly, fists smashing carapace, blood mixing his and theirs in a torrent on the floor. And then, a hiss. The wall itself shifted. A panel ground open. Someone was watching. Specimen Campbell, still mobile. It was the scientist's voice again, calm, detached. Unexpected resilience. The swarm tests you more aggressively than anticipated. Michael howled into the shadows. "Let me out." But the voice ignored him. Data point. Adaptive behavior detected. Colony merging. Secondary hive intelligence forming. Not engineered, emergent. The tone faltered, just slightly. This was not part of design. From the far end of the chamber, the swarm surged. It no longer attacked in random bites. It moved with precision. 2 thick cords of ticks rose like limbs, slamming against the walls, testing them, cracking concrete. The hive was no longer feeding. It was hunting for freedom. Alarms wailed overhead. Doors clanged shut in adjoining halls. The scientist's voice grew urgent. Containment breach risk. All security personnel to disposal wing. Immediate. Michael pressed back against the wall, caught between human captors and inhuman evolution. And for the first time, he realized the government thought it controlled the ticks. It did not. The heavy blast door on the opposite side clanged open. Soldiers rushed in, rifles raised, spraying bullets into the swarm. The chamber filled with thunder, brass casings raining on concrete. Ticks exploded in bursts of ichor. The hive shuddered, its surface tearing, spraying black fluid. But it did not fall. It absorbed. The swarm folded over dead ticks, over corpses, over bullets themselves, swallowing them, growing thicker, darker, stronger. One soldier screamed as a limb of writhing legs lashed out, piercing his chest, snapping ribs like twigs. The others broke ranks, panicked. Gunfire faltered. The hive advanced. Michael dropped to the floor, crawling beneath stacked bodies, forcing himself into the blood-soaked shadows. From there he watched as soldiers were dragged down, stripped of flesh in seconds, their bones gleaming wet in the dim light. The scientist's voice cut in again, no longer calm. All units evacuation protocol. Hive mutation is uncontrolled. Static swallowed the rest. Michael pressed his face into the gore-soaked floor, eyes wide, breath shallow. His heart pounded in rhythm with the hive's pulsing core. This was no longer disposal. This was birth. The swarm tore through soldiers, through steel, through walls. Concrete cracked, rebar twisted. The facility shook with each impact. Michael knew if he stayed, he was nothing but another husk. If he ran, maybe, just maybe, he crawled toward the collapsing breach where the hive pressed outward, the whole jagged, concrete crumbling. Blood smeared his path. His body screamed. But he moved. Behind him, the swarm shrieked, a sound like 1,000 mandibles grinding bone. And as he pulled himself through the breach into the dark beyond, one thought cut through his terror. The government hadn't built a weapon to control homelessness. It had built extinction. Michael dragged himself through the breach, lungs heaving, skin slick with blood and bile. Behind him, the disposal chamber collapsed, concrete bursting inward as the hive pushed through. The sound was deafening, the shriek of twisting rebar, the thunder of falling stone, the chorus of mandibles clicking in unison. He staggered into a maintenance tunnel. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water that hissed as it met the acidic fluids trailing from the swarm. The air burned in his throat. Every breath was metal and rot. But ahead, faint light. An exit. Michael stumbled forward, clutching the jagged wound across his chest. He pushed past broken valves, collapsed ductwork, collapsed stone. Behind him, the sound grew closer. Not footsteps, not pursuit by men, a rolling tide of legs, a writhing carpet of black chitin grinding against steel. The swarm was not chasing him. It was following him. And as he reached the end of the tunnel and shoved open a corroded hatch, he understood why. The hive wasn't interested in him alone. It wanted the surface. Michael collapsed onto dirt and gravel. He was outside. The hills of Pike County stretched around him, jagged ridges under a waning moon, tree lines whispering with cicadas and wind. The faint glow of campfires dotted the valley below, the homeless encampment. People huddled in makeshift tents. Tarps stretched across broken cars. A dog barked faintly in the distance. They had no idea what was coming. Michael tried to rise, but his legs buckled. His body was shredded, hollowed by bites. He could only crawl, nails digging into dirt, leaving streaks of blood behind him. And then the earth shook. The hillside split. Soil collapsed inward, trees snapping like twigs. A roar of stone, dust, and blackness erupted as the ground itself bulged and tore. Ticks poured out, thousands, tens of thousands. They spilled across the hillside in a living river, bodies clattering, mandibles snapping. Their clicking chorus carried through the valley like a death rattle. At their center rose the hive, the massive mound of fused carapaces, pulsing with its black heart, crowned with writhing limbs that scraped against trees, tearing bark like paper. The swarm had risen, and it was hungry. Down in the valley, the first screams began. Campfires flickered as shadows fell across the tents. Figures stumbled from makeshift shelters, pointing toward the hillside, eyes wide. What is that? Bugs? Christ, they're everywhere. Then came the feeding. The ticks fell upon them in waves, biting, tearing, swarming over flesh before voices could rise to shouts. One man swung a length of pipe, smashing clusters into paste, but the swarm climbed his arms, dug into his neck, and he fell thrashing, his face stripped away in seconds. A woman fled toward the woods, clutching a child. The swarm overtook them both, and the child's scream ended in a wet choke. Michael forced himself upright, his voice breaking. "Run! Run!" But his warning was drowned by the tide of chittering. The camp dissolved into panic. People scattered, some charging toward the county road, others vanishing into the woods. But the ticks were faster. They poured between trees, climbing, dropping from branches. They clung to backs, scalps, torsos, jaws snapping. A man staggered with dozens attached to him, arms flailing, then fell, rolling in the dirt as the swarm stripped him clean. A group lit torches, swinging fire in arcs. Ticks hissed and burst under the flames, but the hive surged forward, a black wall blotting out the stars, limbs sweeping tents aside like paper. The valley became a slaughterhouse. Michael stood at the ridge, powerless. His body trembled, blood loss clouding his mind. He saw faces he recognized, drifters he'd shared meals with, men he'd scavenged with in town, women who had told him their stories by firelight. All torn apart in minutes. And beneath it all, a realization settled. This was not an accident. The swarm wasn't a failed experiment. It was the government's answer. A solution to homelessness. Eradication. But like every weapon, it had slipped control. The hive was no longer following orders. It was following hunger. From the distance came the chop of blades. Searchlights swept over the hills, beams catching writhing masses below. Helicopters, military. The government was moving to contain what it had unleashed. Flashes split the night. Gunfire from above, rockets streaking into the valley. Explosions ripped through tents, trees, and ticks alike. Fire spread, consuming bodies. The swarm shrieked, staggering under bombardment. Chitin burst, ichor sprayed, bodies curled and split. But the hive did not fall. It reared higher, absorbing fire, pushing forward through the blaze. And then, in one sudden, violent motion, it leapt. The hive struck a helicopter midder. Its limbs hooked the fuselage, dragging it from the sky. Rotors screamed, snapped, and the craft spun, crashing into the trees in a fireball. The others pulled back, their lights vanishing into the night. On the ridge, Michael staggered back, shielding his face from the blast. Heat washed over him, the stench of burning flesh choking his lungs. The government had not contained it. They had only fed it. The swarm was learning, adapting, growing stronger with every kill. And Pike County was only the beginning. Michael fell to his knees. His vision tunneled, his pulse ragged. He knew he was dying, but he also knew this. The story would not end in the hills. The swarm would spread into town, into Ohio, into every forgotten place the government wanted erased. And when the ticks were done with the homeless, they would turn on everyone else. The hunger was endless. The hive had no master, only appetite. The hills of Pike County echoed with screams long into the night. The ticks, swollen from their grotesque feast, moved in coordinated waves, latching onto flesh with a speed that defied nature. Their irradiated bodies pulsed with an unnatural glow, veins of green and red spidering across their armored shells. Men and women staggered from their tents, clawing at their skin, tearing themselves bloody in a futile attempt to pull the parasites loose. The ground was slick with crimson, the campfire light reflecting off a wet carpet of feeding bodies. The last of the homeless clustered together, backs pressed tight, as though proximity could fend off the tide. One man swung a broken bottle, another a length of rebar, but the ticks came faster than they could kill. For every one crushed beneath a boot, 3 more skittered up pant legs, burrowing into skin, disappearing beneath folds of flesh. Above the carnage, the sound of helicopters churned the air. Spotlights cut through the treetops, revealing the massacre below. For a brief moment, the survivors thought salvation had arrived. But then they saw it, the government insignia stenciled on the choppers. Soldiers in black dropped from ropes, not to rescue, but to observe, to contain. "Let them finish," a voice crackled over the comms. Cold, detached, commanding. The soldiers did not fire on the ticks. They circled the dying instead, pens scratching notes, cameras whirring as men and women fell silent one by one. The experiment was working, and as the last cries dwindled into a wet, buzzing quiet, the ticks turned their glowing eyes not on the bodies, but on the newcomers in black. At first, the soldiers held firm, firing controlled bursts from their rifles, riddling the air with lead. Black ichor sprayed the ground as hundreds of ticks burst apart, but for every one that fell, a dozen more leapt from the trees. They did not scatter this time, they hunted with precision. They remembered. The irradiated swarm descended, clinging to throats, faces, eyes. Screams filled the woods again, but these belonged to soldiers now, their training collapsing in panic. The ticks pierced armor, slid beneath helmets, gnawed through soft tissue with relentless hunger. Within minutes, the clearing was silent save for the faint hiss of burning metal and the gurgling of dying men. The helicopters hovered overhead, then retreated into the night. The government had seen enough. They would call it an industrial accident at the atomic plant, a release of contaminated wildlife. Pike County would be quarantined. Weeks later, the forest was empty, the homeless camp erased. The bodies of soldiers and civilians alike had been picked clean, leaving only gnawed bones buried beneath dead leaves. But sometimes, under the light of the moon, locals swore they could hear it, the faint clicking of mandibles, the rustle of thousands of tiny legs moving in unison. And in the abandoned towns surrounding the woods, cardboard boxes began to appear on doorsteps. Inside each box, neatly folded, lay a piece of flesh, tongue, ear, eye reminders from the swarm, tokens from the experiment the government swore never existed. The irradiated ticks had not been destroyed. They had learned. They had spread, and the hunger had only just begun.